Let me tell you about a burned field. It's November of 1985. The wind coming down the Pecos Valley in southeastern New Mexico is doing what the November wind always does out there. Dry and hard and steady, running along the ground like it has somewhere to be. If you have ever stood on that flat stretch of land between Roswell and Artesia, you know the feel of it. The air smells of alfalfa dust and old irrigation water, and that fall of something else, smoke. Because 30 miles south of the little town of Dexter, at the edge of Hagerman, a farm has burned down to the black ground. And today, the 4th of November, the bank is going to sell what is left of it under a canvas tent set up in a caliche parking lot beside the old Cotton Gin. Now, here's what you need to understand about that morning. The tent is cream-colored canvas glowing from the outside light, and inside it there are maybe 60 men on wooden folding chairs, and another 20 standing along the walls. Numbered bidding paddles rest on knees. The auctioneer is a 60-something man in a gray resistal and a black string tie, standing on a raised plywood platform, tapping his microphone. Behind him, a large handwritten sign says Ranch Auction. The farm on the block is 320 acres that used to belong to a family called Remington. 3 generations of them. In August, during the tail end of a bad drought, a spark from a gasoline generator caught the dry alfalfa stubble. And by the time the volunteer trucks got there from Hagerman, the fire had jumped the ditch and taken the whole west quarter. And then, on a wind shift, come back east and taken the house and the barn and the equipment shed. The Remingtons walked away with what they were wearing. The bank foreclosed by October. The land, in the words of every man in that tent, was dead. Black on top, cracked underneath, no house, no working wellhead, no equipment, a ruin. Which was why the men who mattered in that tent were not there for the Remington place. They were there for the 2 other parcels going up after it. Tidy irrigated 100-acre pieces near Roswell that could be flipped into greenhouse tomatoes. Or the new berry operations the extension office had started talking about. These were the men in pressed dark blue Wranglers and crisp Western shirts with pearl snaps, in new felt Stetson hats and clean unscuffed Lucchese boots. One of them, a fellow named Don Matherson from Roswell, had a brick-sized cellular telephone on his lap, one of the very first ones you ever saw in Chavez County. Another had a brown leather portfolio open on his knee with typed pages of yield projections. These men sat near the front. Their boots were cleaner. The auctioneer knew their names before the bidding started. And in the back of the tent, standing in the aisle by the open flap where the cold sun came in, was a man in a patched wool coat. His name was Wade Henneker. He was 48 years old. He was a widower. He had driven in that morning alone in a 1972 GMC pickup with a cracked dash from Dexter, which is about a 20-minute drive up the valley road. He was not a farmer. He had spent his whole working life as an irrigator for other men's farms, walking rows and setting siphon tubes and reading water. His coat had a mismatched dark patch of wool sewn on the left elbow. His work cap was in his rough hands held in front of him. He was calm and quiet in the way of a man who has already decided something inside himself and shows nothing outside. Wade had come for the burned farm. Now the auctioneer opened the bidding on the Remington place at $15,000 for the 320 acres, which, if you know anything about land in the Pecos Valley in 1985, was a number that told you exactly what everyone in the room thought of the parcel. Alfalfa ground in Chavez County that year was going for $450 an acre easy, and irrigated pieces were fetching $700 and up. $15,000 for 320 acres worked out to under $50 an acre. It was a price that said, this is not really land. This is ash and paperwork. Nobody moved. The auctioneer went to 12. Nobody moved. Don Matherson said something quiet to the fellow next to him, and they both smiled the smile that men in nice hats give each other when they are agreeing that they are the only serious people in the room. The auctioneer went to 10, and then Wade from the back raised his cap. The whole tent turned. I was standing near the registration table that morning myself, and I saw it. 60 men in folding chairs, and every one of them looked back to see who was bidding on a burned farm at $10,000. The auctioneer paused for a full beat and then said, 10,000. Do I hear 12? Do I hear 12? And then the fellow in the front with the cellular telephone laughed, actually laughed out loud, and said, let him have it, boys. I ain't buying charcoal today. And the men around him laughed too. Not cruelly, exactly. More the way you laugh at a child who has ordered the wrong thing off a menu. The auctioneer smiled a little himself and dropped the gavel at $10,000. And then Wade walked up the aisle past all those turned heads to the registration table. And he counted out $10,000 in banded hundreds from a manila envelope in his inside coat pocket. And then he counted out $18,000 more for the closing costs and the county filing and the immediate cash out the bank required. $28,000 in cash from a work coat. And that is where most of the men in that tent would tell you the story ended. If you ask them about the burned farm auction of November 1985, fool from Dexter bought a pile of ash, paid cash, went home. But that is not what this story is really about. Educational note. In the mid-1980s, southeastern New Mexico saw a wave of foreclosure auctions triggered by the collapse of small cotton and alfalfa operations. Rising interest rates, the federal PIK program, and drought years combined to push over-leveraged farms into bank sales, often at prices well below market. Chaves and Eddy counties recorded some of the highest per capita agricultural foreclosure rates in the American Southwest between 1983 and 1987, with many parcels sold for a fraction of their productive value. Part 2. Now, to understand why Wade Henneker walked into that tent that morning with $28,000 in an envelope, you have to go back a long way, all the way back to 1954, when Wade was 17 years old and his father was still alive and running the little blacksmith shop off Main Street in Dexter that had belonged to his father before him. Wade's father was named Elmer Henneker. He shod horses and welded harrow teeth and fixed the arms of hay rakes, and he did not farm. But behind the shop there was a piece of land, an acre and a half of good river bottom that Elmer rented for a small monthly amount from an old Mexican gardener named Don Honorio Vega. Don Honorio was in his 70s then, born in Chihuahua, brought to New Mexico as a boy in the 1890s. He had a face like a walnut, a straw hat with a wide brim, and he grew chili and squash and a little corn on that acre and a half behind the shop. Elmer did not need the land, but he rented it because Don Honorio was old and living alone, and the rent gave him dignity. And in exchange, Don Honorio taught Wade, not farming exactly. What Don Honorio taught Wade was how to read a piece of ground. He would take him out along the ditches and point to the willows and say, "Where willows grow, water comes back." He would break a piece of caliche in his fingers and hold it under Wade's nose and say, "Smell that, mijo. That is calcium. That is old sea." He would kneel by the acequia that ran along the edge of his acre, and he would say, "This ditch was dug in 1892 by my uncle Refugio and 3 other men with pickaxes over one summer." The pump did not exist then. Then the electric pumps came, and men filled in the ditches because they thought they did not need them anymore. But the ditches are still under the ground, mijo. They remember where the water went. The grass grows differently over them, if you know how to look. And then Don Honorio would say the thing he said to Wade many times over the 2 years they walked those fields together. He would say it in Spanish, and then he would say it in English, so it would sit inside Wade both ways. La tierra recuerda lo que le devuelves y olvida lo que le quitas. The land remembers what you give back to it, and forgets what you take. Wade remembered this the way you remember something a person told you when you were young enough that you did not have to work to memorize it. It just settled in. In the summer of 1954, on a hot, bright morning in July, Don Honorio took Wade 30 miles south, all the way down the valley to a place near Hagerman, where a family called Remington had a big alfalfa operation. Don Honorio had worked those fields as a young man, back before the Remingtons owned them, when the land had belonged to a Spanish family called Baca. And he walked Wade out into the middle of the Remington East Quarter, and he pointed at the ground, and he said, "Mijo, look. Right here, and here, and here. See how the alfalfa grows a little darker along these lines? That was an acequia. My uncle helped dig it in the 1890s. It is filled in now. The Remingtons do not know it is there, but the calcium from the ditch bed is still down there. And where calcium sits, alfalfa grows better forever. Remember this ground, mijo. If it ever comes cheap, buy it." Wade was 17 and he laughed because he was never going to buy 320 acres in Hagerman. He was going to be an irrigator, or maybe help his father in the shop. But Don Honorio said again quietly, "Remember this ground. Don Honorio died in the winter of 1956. He left Wade the little leather notebook he had carried all his life, with drawings of the old acequias in the Baca fields, sketched in pencil, labeled in his careful Spanish. Wade put the notebook in a wooden box under his bed and mostly did not look at it for years. Wade grew up. He married a woman named Mary Lou from Artesia in 1961. He worked as an irrigator, first for the Bostwicks and then for the Kellermans and then, for the last stretch of his working life, for a big alfalfa outfit north of Dexter called the Bar S. He and Mary Lou never had children. They lived in a single wide trailer on a half-acre at the edge of town. She kept a garden. He walked rows. They were happy in the quiet way that people are happy when they are not asking the world for much. And starting in January of 1967, when Wade was 30 years old, he did something. Once a month, on the first Friday after payday, he took $40 out of his check, and he put it in a manila envelope in the bottom of a coffee can in the kitchen cupboard behind the flour. He labeled the envelope in pencil with 2 words, Remington ground. Some months when the alfalfa was good and the Bar S paid him extra, he put in $50 or $60. He never skipped a month. Not one month. Not the month his mother died in 1971. Not the month the transmission went out on the pickup in 1974. Not the month Mary Lou got sick in the winter of 1980 and the doctor bills started coming. Not the months after she died in 1981 and he lived on beans and rice for a stretch out of grief and habit. $40 a month, sometimes $50, sometimes $60, into the envelope for 19 years. Meanwhile, the valley boomed. The 1970s were good years for alfalfa and cotton, and everybody around him was borrowing to expand. His neighbors bought new tractors on credit, took out second mortgages to add greenhouses, put money into the new sunflower operations up around Roswell. Wade sat still. People teased him a little. Wade, they said, you're gonna die in that trailer. Wade would smile a small smile and say, probably will. And then he would go home and put $40 in the envelope. Educational note. Don Honorio's teaching reflected a real practice known in the Southwest as the acequia tradition. Beginning in the 16th century in New Mexico, communities dug small gravity-fed ditches to distribute water across arid fields. Many of these acequias were abandoned in the 20th century when electric well pumps replaced them, but the mineral deposits left in the old ditch beds, particularly calcium carbonate from caliche soils, often continued to enrich crop growth along their original lines for generations after the ditches themselves had been filled in. Part 3. Now here is where the story turns, and I want you to stay with me through it, because the turning happens slow at first and then all at once. The way things do in real life. The 1980s came into the Pecos Valley the way a bad storm comes into an open field. In 1981, the interest rates the Federal Reserve had pushed up in the late 70s started biting into everything. Alfalfa prices, which had been strong for a decade, softened. Then cotton went down. Then the federal PIK program in 1983 ended up scrambling everybody's cash flow because the payments came in kind, in bushels of grain. And men who needed cash to pay operating loans were suddenly holding grain they could not sell fast enough. And the banks, especially the First National up in Roswell, started calling notes. I watched it happen, standing right there in Dexter. And I want to tell you the names, because names matter in a story like this. I watched Buddy Kellerman, who had farmed 400 acres of alfalfa and cotton east of town, and had put a second mortgage on his home place in 1979 to buy a new center pivot irrigation rig, lose the pivot in 1983 when the bank came for it, and then lose the home place in 1985. Buddy did not complain publicly. He got a job driving a hay truck for another outfit and grew smaller inside himself the way a man grows smaller when something large has been taken from him. I watched the Bostwick brothers, who had run a good sound alfalfa operation for years, and then in 1978 had partnered with a fellow from Lubbock on a sunflower processing venture up in Roswell. Come out of that partnership in 1984 with lawsuits on both sides and 40 acres less than they had gone in with. The younger Bostwick brothers started drinking. The older one just stopped talking at church. And I watched Don Matherson. Don had borrowed heavily through the early 80s to build one of the first big greenhouse tomato operations in Chavez County. 12 acres of glass and steel south of Roswell, financed by the First National at variable rates. In 1989, his main wholesale buyer, a produce distributor out of Dallas, went bankrupt, owing Don $92,000. In 1990, a whitefly infestation swept through greenhouse tomatoes across southern New Mexico. By 1993, the greenhouse operation was in receivership, and Don was selling insurance out of a small office on Main Street in Roswell. And through those same years, Wade Henneker went to work. He did not move fast. He did not clear the whole 320 acres at once. What he did, starting in the spring of 1986, was walk every foot of that burned Remington ground with Don Honorio's leather notebook in his coat pocket. And he found the lines. The fire had done him a favor. It had burned off every weed and every old alfalfa stalk and every mesquite root down to the char. And when Wade walked the ground in the first weeks after the sale, before any new grass had come back, he could see the faint, darker channels in the black soil where the oldest sequoias had run. They matched, foot for foot, the sketches Don Honorio had made in 1954. Wade redug the main sequoia by hand, and with a small used backhoe he bought for $2,000 from a fellow in Artesia. He did not put in a pump. He tapped into the existing ditch system that ran along the county road, which the Remingtons had let go to weeds, and he negotiated a water right transfer through the Pecos Valley Artesian Conservancy District, which took him 19 months and $1,100 in filing fees, and a lot of afternoons in the county office in Roswell. He planted the first 60 acres of alfalfa in 1987, along the calcium-rich line of the old sequoia. He planted a small 10-acre patch of green chili in 1988, on a corner where Don Honorio's notebook had marked Terreno Bueno para Chile. That first cutting of alfalfa in the summer of '88 came in at 4.5 tons to the acre. The county extension agent, a young fellow named Rick Vasquez, drove out to look at it because he did not believe the number. He walked the field with Wade and he said, "Wade, this ground was ash 3 years ago. What the hell did you do?" Wade said, "I just followed the old ditches." Rick Vasquez wrote it up in a small article for the New Mexico State University Extension Bulletin, and a few farmers read it and mostly forgot about it, because by 1988, most of them had bigger problems than one man's alfalfa yield. By 1991, Wade had 220 of his 320 acres in production. He was pulling 5 tons to the acre on alfalfa and 13,000 pounds to the acre on chile. He owed nothing. Not $1 to any bank, on anything. He was still living in the trailer at the edge of Dexter. He was still driving the 1972 GMC. And one afternoon in the spring of 1994, at the Allsup's gas station on the corner of Main and 2nd in Dexter, Don Matherson walked over to Wade at the fuel pump. Don was not wearing a Stetson anymore. He was wearing a windbreaker and a baseball cap. He looked older than he had any right to look, and he stood there with his hands in the pockets of the windbreaker, and he looked at the gravel of the parking lot for a moment, and then he looked up, and his face had changed into something more direct. He said, "Wade, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know I'm asking it honestly." Wade waited. Don said, "How did you know?" "About that ground. Everybody in the county laughed at you that morning. I laughed at you. And now you're pulling 5 tons an acre off ash, and I'm selling insurance. How did you know?" He was not asking it the way he might have asked it in 1985 from the front row of the auction tent, with that wide, easy volume that carried across the room. He was asking it the way a man asks when he genuinely does not know the answer, and has recently paid a price for not knowing it. Educational note. The 1980s farm crisis affected New Mexico differently than the Corn Belt because of the region's mixed reliance on irrigated specialty crops. Between 1983 and 1993, Chavez and Eddy counties saw over 40% of small greenhouse and berry operations enter foreclosure, while traditional alfalfa growers with paid-off land and low input costs generally survived the decade. The greenhouse tomato boom of the early 80s collapsed particularly hard due to whitefly infestations and wholesale distribution failures. Part 4. Wade looked at Don Matherson for a long moment. At the pump, on that spring afternoon in 1994, there was a semi-truck idling on the far side of the lot and the smell of diesel in the air. Wade set the nozzle back on the pump. He wiped his hands on his jeans. He looked at Don, and he said the thing Don Honorio had said to him 40 years earlier, at the edge of a hand-dug ditch on a piece of ground behind a blacksmith shop in Dexter. He said, "The land remembers what you give back to it, and it forgets what you take." Don Matherson stood there and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "That's it. "That's the whole thing." Wade said, "That's most of it." Don said, "Who told you that?" Wade said, "An old man taught me when I was 17. He walked me across the Remington ground in 1954, and he told me to remember it. So I did." Don Matherson nodded, slow, several times. He did not say anything else. He got in his car, and he drove back to Roswell. He and Wade never spoke again after that afternoon. Wade kept working the ground through the 90s and into the 2000s. He never expanded past the 320 acres. When people asked him why, he would say, "This is the piece I was told to remember." When his nephew Caleb, his sister's boy, finished at New Mexico State in agriculture in 1999, Wade brought him out to walk the fields and taught him what Don Honorio had taught him, the willows and the caliche, and the way the grass reeds over an old ditch. Caleb listened and took notes. Wade got old. His back went first, then his knees, then the slow tiredness that comes for men who have walked rows for 50 years. In the fall of 2008, the doctor at the clinic in Roswell told him his heart was not what it used to be. Wade thanked him and drove home, and did not tell anybody. He kept working until the middle of December of 2008, when Caleb came out one morning to help him move a broken siphon tube and found him sitting on the tailgate of the old GMC looking across the alfalfa field with a strange, peaceful look on his face. Wade said, "Caleb, sit with me a minute." They sat. Wade said, "If anything happens, the notebook is in the wooden box under my bed. You take it. You keep going." Caleb said, "Yes, sir." Wade Henneker died in his sleep in the trailer at the edge of Dexter on the 18th of January, 2009. He was 72 years old. There were 41 people at the funeral at the Little Methodist Church on Main Street. Don Matherson was one of them, sitting in the back. He shook Caleb's hand at the door of the church and said, "Your uncle was the smartest man I ever laughed at." Then he left. The week after the funeral, Caleb went to the trailer to sort through his uncle's things. He did it the way you go through a life, carefully, slowly, with the awareness that objects carry weight that has nothing to do with their physical mass. In the kitchen cupboard behind the floor, he found a coffee can with an old manila envelope inside it. The envelope was empty now, but the words Remington ground were still written on it in pencil, faded in his uncle's small, careful hand. Under the bed, in the wooden box, he found the notebook. It was small, leather-bound, the leather gone soft with age and handling. The pages were thin and dry. On the front, in ink that had faded to brown, was written H. Vega, Agosto de 1894. The first pages were in his Uncle Refugio's older hand, sketches of the original acequias in the Baca fields near Hagerman. Then Don Honorio's careful pencil sketches from the 1920s and 30s, noting where the calcium ran heaviest, where chili grew best, where the willows returned after wet years. And near the back, in Don Honorio's hand from 1954, a 2-page detailed sketch of the Remington East Quarter, with the old acequia lines marked in dashed pencil and small notes in Spanish along the margins. Terreno bueno para alfalfa, terreno bueno para chile. La calicha corre aquí. And on the very last page of the notebook, in his Uncle Wade's handwriting, not Don Honorio's, was a single line, just one, written in ballpoint pen, in the small block letters of a man who had not written much in his life, but had thought about this sentence for a long time before he wrote it down. La Tierra Recuerda. Bought November 1985. Paid in full. That was all. No other entry after it. No explanation. No summary of the years. No accounting of the yields or the money. Just those 3 lines. The Spanish. The date of the auction. And the 2 words that were the closest thing to a signature Wade Henneker ever left behind. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed in his uncle's trailer with the notebook open on his lap and the winter light coming in through the small window over the sink. And he understood, in the way you understand something all at once when a life has just closed, that the whole story of his Uncle Wade was contained in those 3 lines. The waiting. The learning. The keeping of a promise made to an old man on a piece of ground in 1954. The 19 years of $40 envelopes. The morning in November of 1985 in the auction tent, with the wind pulling at the canvas. All of it. In 3 lines on the last page of a notebook that was older than Wade had been when he first held it. Caleb closed the notebook. He put it back in the wooden box. He drove out to the Hagerman fields the next morning in his own truck, and he walked the rows where the alfalfa was resting under the winter. And he stood for a while at the edge of the main acequia his uncle had redug in the spring of 1986. And he did not say anything out loud. The wind came down the valley the way it always did. The willows along the ditch bank were bare and gray. The ground held. Educational note. Traditional acequia systems in New Mexico are today recognized as a form of intangible cultural heritage, protected under state acequia law dating to 1987. Many originally hand-dug irrigation ditches from the Spanish colonial period continue to operate in the northern part of the state, while in the Pecos Valley most were abandoned after 1920. Modern soil studies have confirmed that calcium and organic matter deposits along former acequia beds can enhance crop yields for over a century after the ditches themselves have ceased to carry water.